Andreas, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
My first question, you've been in Ukraine since September 2013, so you've been watching the Maidan developments.
Yes.
What can you say? What were your impressions during these two years?
Wow, I mean, it's been almost 3 years. Of course, the Maidan developments is something that I think all of us diplomats that were here is something that we will remember for the rest of our lives. Of course, I was, as others, watching the events, very impressed by the courage and the resilience showed by the demonstrators. The fact that people were willing to pay with their own lives in order to change their country into a better country is something that, you know, made a huge impression on me while watching these events.
Do you think that in Sweden people also watch these events closely and understand this aspect you mentioned?
Absolutely. I mean, this was something that was very closely covered by Swedish media. There's for a long time been strong interest from the Swedish side towards Ukraine. And the whole Maidan protests, the whole turbulent time also thereafter, the annexation of Crimea, the Russian aggression in the east, all of this has been very closely followed by Swedish media and by the Swedish people. And not only the Swedish government, but also the Swedish people have been very strong in its support for Ukraine's independence and for Ukraine's territorial integrity.
But it's very interesting, like Sweden was indeed a friend of Ukraine for a long time. And we know that, for example, it was one of the initiators of Eastern Partnership,
Yes.
bringing Ukraine closer to the EU.
Yeah.
And we know that in the EU, there are different countries with different views, you know. We also remember Carl Bildt, the former foreign minister, who is also probably one of the strongest in criticizing Russia. Why is that? Why is that interest to Eastern Europe and to this position?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. One important reason is that for us, medium-sized, small country, the right for a country to choose its own future is paramount for us. And when we have seen how Russia has trying to influence Ukraine and trying to stop Ukraine's right to choose its own path, Swedish people and the Swedish government has reacted very strongly. Secondly, if there's one notion which is very important both to Swedish people and Swedish politicians, it's international law. And sort of medieval grabbing of land of a neighboring country is something that Swedes and Swedish politicians react very strongly to. And the Russians' illegal annexation of Crimea was something that Swedish government and Swedish people reacted very strongly towards. And also the Russian aggression in the east, which is also a very blunt violation of international law. This is something that Sweden has reacted very strongly to.
But let's also talk about Ukraine internal reforms, because Sweden, for many Ukrainians, is a kind of a model country. It's a kind of a country which is famous for its transparency, for its equality. And these are issues that Ukraine tries to implement, for example, transparency, right? To make authorities more transparent. How do you estimate the progress right now?
Well, I think that, of course, right now, a lot of focus, both among diplomats and among Ukrainians, is directed toward the political turbulence in the country. But I think there is a risk that we get caught up in the moment, only concentrating on the turbulence that we have right now. And I think in order to give a more fair estimation of the achievements that have been done, we have to look back to where Ukraine was 2 years ago. And when we look at the time span during the last 2 years, I still believe that the glass is half full when it comes to the achievements. There has been some impressive achievements in many areas.
For example, what is the most impressive for you?
I think a few things. I mean, first of all, the macroeconomic stabilization has been quite impressive. The fact that Ukraine, this government, has been able to follow and implement the IMF program, which is rather unusual for Ukrainian governments to continue to follow the IMF program, it has been very positive. The fact that under the leadership of the Minister of Finance, Ukraine has been able to conduct impressive debt restructuring, reducing the burden of the debt costs for the budget and for the state is quite impressive. Bank sector, also another area where I've been impressed, not least by the central bank, the national bank, which has been able to liquidate almost 1/3 of all the banks in Ukraine without the system, collapsing. Another area where I'm very impressed is decentralization. Even, before the second reading of the changes of the constitution regarding decentralization. Already now we have had some important changes when it comes to financial decentralization, basically moving the responsibility for the financial side from the center to the local level, moving decision-making closer to the citizens, which we believe, Sweden, I believe, strengthens democracy.
What about the transparency reforms? Like you have the Prozoro system for public procurement, and also all these, anti-corruption initiatives which are not put in place, but still there is some progress in all this issue of electronic declarations.
Yes,
right?
yes.
What do you think about
I think transparency. I'm happy that for the last 1.5 years, transparency has really been a buzzword within Ukrainian politics, and I think that has been very positive. I mean, we have some important achievements when it comes to access to official documents, which must be, Christmas presents for journalists like yourself. That it's much easier now to get access to official documents. We've had the Prozoro, as you pointed out, which the government hopes will save the state budget approximately 50 billion euro hryvnias a year. So these changes have been incredibly important. As you pointed out, Sweden has been, at the forefront when it comes to transparency. And it all goes back to the importance of freedom of speech, I would say, where we have one of the oldest legislations in the world. And we have a very strong tradition that the public must have full insight in what is being done by the politicians. And I think the good thing about this transparency in Sweden is that it has established or built a strong trust between authorities and citizens.
For example, in Sweden, really every citizen can know the incomes of anybody.
Yes, basically.
Do you think that it is working well? I mean, for the society?
I think it's working very well because it strengthens the contract between authorities, politicians, and citizens, which has made Swedes much more trusting when it comes to decision makers. Let me give you one example. We have one of the highest tax levels, income taxes in Europe, in Sweden. Still, not many people complain about it. Why? Because there is a general trust that authorities will use this tax money and spend them in a good way, which is good for society, spending on schools, hospitals, roads. And that trust that the politicians will actually spend their money in a wise way has been made possible through this transparency, I would say.
We've talked about your positive experience. What are your criticisms of Ukraine?
I think it's, what most people would identify as the biggest disappointments, and that is the fight against corruption, where we haven't seen enough results. I also think that in order to be more efficient in fighting corruption, there has to be more improvement, faster reforms when it comes to the justice system. Basically, the rule of law is not strong enough in Ukraine. And I can see that when I'm trying to promote Ukraine towards Swedish investors, and I spend as much time promoting Sweden and Ukraine as I spend trying to promote Ukraine to Swedish investors and to Swedes.
Are they willing to come?
They're interested. And what I've discovered is that whether it's investors, politicians, friends and family of mine, everyone that has been here have left much more optimistic and with a much more positive impression about Ukraine than when they came. So I think it's important to bring them here. But in order to convince investors to make, big investments into Ukraine, for that to happen, you have to strengthen the rule of law. the justice system has to be more independent, more efficient, and less corrupt. I think that is really, you know, the key priority for 2016.
Let's talk about the assistance that you're giving, that Sweden is giving. You have the very famous program SIDA.
Yeah.
And what are your priorities? To which fields are you willing to support?
Well, I'm very, you know, proud that I'm representing a country that has been one of Ukraine's biggest supporters for the last 2 years, both politically. I mean, our response to the Russian aggression has been very clear, and we have also advocated a clear response from the EU in terms of sanctions. But also when it comes to support, financial support. We have a SIDA program, as you rightly pointed out, worth approximately 20 to 25 million euros, based on 3 different sectors. One is energy efficiency, incredibly important, where approximately 40% of our investments go. Another is democratic governance and human rights. Part of this assistance is support to Ukrainian civil society. We provide core support for 13 different organizations. Why? Well, it's because we believe that the civil society is probably the strongest driving force for change in the country. The third area is market development and support to small and medium-sized Ukrainian companies.
Is it grants or is it loans?
It's both. I mean, it comes in different forms. Basically, what we're
how can these small and medium enterprises get this assistance? What would you advise?
I mean, we work through different corporations, for example, with other international financial institutions, but we're also trying to look how we can help small and medium-sized businesses to utilize the free trade agreement, which came into force 1st of January this year. By the way, that's another achievement, not only by Ukraine, but by the EU and Ukraine. The fact that Ukrainian business today has access to the world's single biggest market, 500 million consumers. And that's one of the reasons why I'm hopeful regarding Ukrainian economy as well, because what we saw in the 90s was that a lot of production moved from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. Slovakia today is the biggest car manufacturer per capita. And I'm sure that if the conditions are right in Ukraine, those factories will sooner or later move to Ukraine. So Ukraine really has the possibility to be the sort of manufacturing hub of Europe.
Let's finish maybe by political questions. So how do you estimate the implementation of Minsk agreements? Because I have an impression that we are moving towards a situation where nobody really believes in it, in this agreement anymore.
Yeah, I mean, a few starting points when it comes to the Swedish view. The first important starting point is that we believe that there's one aggressor and there's one victim. The aggressor is Russia, the victim is Ukraine. Secondly, we believe that if Russia would like to sort of end this conflict, stop this conflict, they could do that in a matter of days, if not hours. They could simply stop pouring in weapons, soldiers into Ukraine. They could stop their propaganda. They started this conflict, and they were able to end the conflict as well. Thirdly, I understand if people have, you know, opinions on the Minsk Agreement. It's not a perfect agreement. But peace agreements never are perfect agreements because they're part of a compromise. And I think it's important to realize that the Minsk Agreement is what we say in diplomatic lingo, the only game in town. It's the only roadmap we have towards sort of ending the conflict. So we really hope that the Minsk Agreement, the implementation of the Minsk Agreement will be more successful in the weeks and months that will come. We realize that it is difficult for Ukraine to implement its part when Russia is not doing enough on their part when it comes to implementing the ceasefire. There are quite a lot of ceasefire violations at the moment. Another example where Russia is lacking political will is providing access for international observers. But still, it's important that Ukraine shows willingness to implement its part, because Ukraine cannot afford to lose what we call the blame game if the Minsk Agreement would fail.
But you mean its part, it's, what do you mean? It's constitutional reform, election
I mean,
law?
it's what is pointed out in the Minsk Agreement. It's the local elections, it's the constitutional changes. Again, I realize that it's challenging for Ukraine to do it at this moment when their ceasefire is not respected. But I think it's important that Ukraine shows that it's willing to do it.
How we know that the Minsk process is a part of the Normandy process, and it's led from the European side by France and Germany, not by the EU. How you, as Sweden, how other countries of the EU, like Poland or I don't know, others, can influence this process while they are a little bit out of the game? I
mean, you're right. The Minsk format is made up by France, Ukraine, Russia, and Ukraine. And
Germany.
And Germany, of course. And the EU is not, as an entity, part of the Minsk or the Normandy format. But of course, we have regular discussions in Brussels and between the EU states. So we're able also to present our views when it comes to the implementation of the Minsk Agreement. And mind you that the sanctions against Russia, which are a key factor in this whole game, they will not be lifted until Russia has implemented its part of the Minsk Agreement. So in that way, the EU has an important role to play also when it comes to the implementation of the Minsk Agreement.
Is there arguments like that, you know, look, Ukraine is also falling short of implementing its part, no constitutional reform, and therefore let's lift sanctions and forget about it?
That is the risk that Ukraine cannot allow itself to take. That's what I mean. That's why it's so important that Ukraine does not lose the so-called blame game. Ukraine has to show that it's willing to implement its part. From Swedish perspective, we see no reason whatsoever to change the sanctions. We do not believe that Russia has done nearly enough to motivate such a discussion. But
do you think the pressure is growing for lifting the sanctions?
Well, I think in order for that pressure not to grow, it's important for Ukraine to do its part. And when it comes to the EU and the different opinions within the EU, for a long time there's been discussions, you know, that the EU is not unified. But still, I mean, if someone would tell me 2 years ago that the EU would impose strong sanctions against Russia, I would have said that that's probably not possible. But we were able to unite around strong sanctions against Russia. But again, let me stress that in order not to risk sort of that discussion to surface about whether or not to prolong the sanctions against Russia, it's incredibly important that Ukraine shows willingness to implement its part.